Welcome developers to this presentation on EMS Authentication and Authorization. My name is Jim Tierney. I'm a longtime member of the Rad Studio development team here at Embarcadero Technologies. In this presentation I'm going to build an EMS client application. This client application is going to log in and sign up users, create a user group, and also call a backend endpoint with authorization credentials. I will modify the emsserver.ini file to show how to declare authorization rules, and then I will demonstrate how the authorization rules can allow or deny access to particular resources by particular users. Okay, before I start building a client application, I'm going to run the EMS dev server setup wizard. I want to run the setup wizard so that we can start with a clean EMS server database and a clean emsserver.ini file. The EMS setup wizard runs automatically the first time you run the EMS dev server. This is because the EMS dev server detects whether you have an ini file, and if you don't, it will run the setup wizard to create the ini file and the EMS server database. I'm going to force the EMS dev server to run the setup wizard by passing a command line option when I start the dev server. The command line option is -setup. Okay, this is the setup wizard. I'm going to use the default options except for the one where you specify the directory. I'm going to put in my bin directory for xe7. This way the ini file will be created in an easy to locate directory. This is prompting me to overwrite some files, and that's okay. This is telling me that it created the EMS server database, the ini file, and it also created some sample data. A user called test with a password called testpass, and a user group called test group that contains the user test. Now I can open the console to see what it shows me. So I'll choose login on the console. I've already logged in the past, so it remembered my password, which is console pass. Under users, I can see our new user test. This message says created by EMS setup, password is test. That's wrong. The password is actually test pass. Under groups, we have test group, and it contains one user, which is test. All right, now I'll create a application. An EMS client application will need an EMS provider component. The server is running on localhost. On port 8080. Test our connection to see that it works. Now I'm going to add a BackendAuth component. This component is going to be used to log in and log out. I'll show the live bindings designer, and we'll hook up some controls to enter the username and password. Choose T-edit and T-edit. Put a button for the login call. So when we click this button, the username and password will be passed to the EMS server and it'll attempt to log us in. So let's try the application out. Try the username and password created by the EMS setup wizard. Alright, there was no error. Let's try something that's invalid to see what happens. We see in that case we get an error. As you can see, I've made some changes. I added a couple of layouts and I put the controls that we added before into one layout, and then I added a new button, a logout button, and a couple of labels and put them into another layout. And what I want to do with these two layouts is hide one when the user's logged in and hide the other one when the user's logged out. So I've written some code here that looks at the logged in property of the backend auth login and hides the appropriate layout. I've also added code for the logout button to call the logout method on the backend auth component. And the other thing I've done is use live bindings to display the username into the label field here. So what will happen when this application runs is that the first thing is the form create will run. It'll call the show login to show the login layout. And then when we log in, we should see the login panel disappear and the logout panel displayed. So now we see the label populated with the name of the user, logged in user. We can log out and return to the login fields. I think we would like these to be cleared when we log out, so I'm going to go over here to the event handlers for the backend auth component, and in the logout I'm going to call the clear field values method. Now that we've covered logging in and logging out, I'd like to show you how to sign up a new user. I've modified this form by adding a tab control and tab item for login, and I moved all the components we had before onto the login page. And the sign up tab is where I'd like to add some new controls for signing up. So I'll start out by adding another backend auth component. I'll call this sign up. And we'll use the live bindings designer to add some more fields. The live bindings designer creates the controls at the root level of the form rather than within the tab. So I'm going to use the structure view to move those controls so that they're parented by the tab control. I'm hiding the elements that we don't need to see in the live bindings designer to reduce the clutter. In addition to the username and password, I'm going to have another field on this form. What I'd like is to store the email address of any user that signs up. So I'm going to go into the backend auth signup component. I'm going to add to this collection of custom user details. Oops. So the detail I'm going to add is called email. You can use user details for other values. You might have address or other kinds of things that you want to keep track of with each signed up user. I've added a field so that the user can type in the email address, and then we'll need a button to sign up. Okay. Now, in order to see what's going on in this sample application, I'm going to display all the users on this page also. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to tell that we actually signed up a user. I'll put a backend query component on this form, and indicate that I want it to query to the users. There's choices here: groups, users, things that we can query when using EMS. We'll go ahead and link this query component, the result, to a memo. Okay. So this memo will just display the JSON representation of all the users that have been signed up. Word wrap. And we need a button to execute the query. And call Okay, let's give this a try. First, we'll get our users. So we have their user test. That was the one that was created by the setup wizard. And then we'll add a new user, call him A. Let's get the users. We can see that we have a new user, A, and it has an email here. We can go over to our login page and we can log in A. Oops, I see that I didn't parent my memo control correctly, but anyway, we'll log in, and we were able to log in A. All right, now I'd like to talk about groups. So I've added a new tab called Groups, and I'm going to add some controls to add groups and or add a group and view the groups that are in the EMS database. Groups are used to put users into like categories so that when you're authorizing access to a particular resource, you can check whether the user that's making the request is a member of a particular group. So I'm going to put edit control here for a new group. So and we'll put a button to add a group. All right, we'll use the backend groups component to add our group. When we click the button, we'll call backend groups groups create group. We'll give the name of our group. If we wanted to pass custom properties, like for example, we had an email property associated with the user, then we would pass a JSON object here. I'm just going to pass nil in this case, and we pass an entity object which is going to have information about the group. Then to show groups, we're going to use a backend query. I dropped a memo, and we'll link the memo to the backend query component. And we'll add a button to execute the query. Okay, let's go ahead and try that out. Better put the execute method first. Okay, we have the group that was added by the setup wizard. And we'll go ahead and add another group. And there's our additional group. Okay, now we can add some code to add a user to a group. So we'll copy and paste these controls. We'll need a user ID here. And so when we click the button, we'll call backend groups component. Okay, now we have the code in place to add a user to a group. So when we click this button, it'll add the user identified by this control to the group identified by this control. So here's our groups that we have so far. A group. A group is the one we wanted to add to. We'll need to get a user ID. So I'm going to go ahead and get the users over here, and we'll copy this ID. And add that user to the group. So now when we get to the groups, we'll see that this group, A group, has this user ID. And that user ID happens to be user A. Now I'm going to show how to authorize access to EMS resources using the logged in user. On the login page, I'm going to add some components to execute a request. I'm going to put a backend endpoint component on the page, and I'm going to set a property so that it'll invoke the version resource on the EMS server. It's going to make a GET request to the version resource. I'll also put a button on the form to execute the endpoint. When the button's clicked, we'll execute the endpoint. I'm going to put a memo on the form. I'll use this memo to display the result of the endpoint request. So the response JSON is going to be displayed in the memo after we execute the endpoint request. I'm just going to take a moment to clean up the Live Bindings Designer. All right, so let's go ahead and execute that request. And we can see that we get the JSON. Now what I want to do is pass the logged in user when I make a request to the EMS server using the backend endpoint. So to do this, I'm going to select the endpoint component and set the auth property to our login component. This was the BackendAuth login component. Whenever we use this login button, the login component is going to keep track of the user that's logged in. If we log out, then it'll clear that information. And because we've connected the backend endpoint to that login component, the login component will let the backend endpoint know the information to pass when it makes a request to identify the logged in user. Let's go ahead and run this application now. Right now we're not logged in, and if we go over to the EMS server and clear, we'll make a request, and here it says here that the user is blank, or there is no user identified in this request. If we log in with our user A and then make a request, you can see that the request to the version resource has this user identifier, which corresponds to our user called A. If we log out and make a request, then we'll see that once again the user is blank. Now I'm going to show you how to modify the emsserver.ini file to specify access rules. At the bottom of the emsserver.ini file are some comments that describe how to specify access rules. This is all within this section. I'm going to add a rule for the version resource. This rule is going to indicate that only the user A can execute endpoints within the version resource. The rule applies to users, that's what this means, and then all the users are in a JSON array. So I could add additional users to this array. Okay, I'm saving this file, and I will go over and I need to close the server so that it'll reload the ini file. The log indicates that an access rule has been defined. Now let's run our sample application. So if we try to execute, we're not logged in, we get an unauthorized request error. We'll log in as A, and then our request is allowed. If we log in as a different user, the request is also unauthorized. Now I'm going to make another change to the emsserver.ini file. This time, instead of authorizing based on users, I'm going to authorize based on groups. A group is the group that we created with the sample application. I'm going to save this file. I'm going to stop the server and restart it. Now I'll run the sample application. Not logged in, so unauthorized. Log in as A. A is authorized. Test is not authorized. However, we can add test to our group. And now test is also authorized. Thank you for watching this presentation about EMS authentication and authorization. Follow the links below for additional information about EMS.
Jim, can you contrast the use of BAS client components in EMS as to how we also use them, I guess, with parse and convey? I mean, everything is REST and JSON ultimately, but do you want to explain a little of the connection or similarity and obviously dissimilarity in EMS versus what we do with the backend as a service providers?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of the general similarity, when you use EMS, you as a developer or somebody who's creating a solution with EMS, you're going to be responsible for deploying the EMS server. Typically, you would deploy it on as an ISAPI DLL. When you use parse or Kinvi, of course, that's in the cloud, and parse and Kinvi are responsible for having the server running somewhere. So that's the basic difference. And when it comes to your business logic, you could write, using EMS, you could write business logic that uses your actual databases within your organization. Whereas with parse or Kinvi, you kind of have to have some kind of bridge, or you use their data, their storage system instead of your own. So there's some kind of differences. In terms of the components, and in terms of developing an application as an EMS client versus developing an application as a Kinvi or parse client, the components are shared. I mean, so there's an abstraction that we did for parse and Kinvi. We abstracted the cloud services. So there's a notion of users. There's a notion of storage for parse and Kinvi, and where it's possible, where there's an overlap between the functionality of EMS and parse and Kinvi, we support the operations in the same way. So the backend users component is used the same way on Kinvi, parse, and EMS. The backend auth component is used the same way also. That's a new component that we put into XE7. That's a general idea.
There was a question from an earlier session, but I promised that I would bring it up during this session, and it had to do specifically in this world of authentication authorization. The developer was asking, are there plans for or how they would approach doing things like LDAP authentication or other directory user kind of authentication?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think the basic idea is that you want to pass credentials that are not the EMS credentials, or not the parse credentials, or not the Kinvi credentials. And then if those credentials are valid, then you actually log into or create a new Kinvi or parse or EMS user. And we're working on that idea. I know that on parse there are some services for doing that. So that's definitely something that we want to investigate.
But in EMS today, I could write code, right? If I wanted to write some code in my EMS server-side applications that would call out to other APIs to look up a user before I would create a user, for example, in the EMS system, or you were doing that in the demos here where you could create users, manage groups, and so on. Is there a way to hook in calling out to LDAP or what is it, Microsoft Active Directory or email services, whatever it might be, for authentication?
Right, yeah. I mean, what you'd want to do is you could have, so in EMS, you add your own custom resources. So I did, for my demo, it's very simple. I'm just using the existing resource, the version resource. But you would add your own resources by creating a EMS package. And in your package, you would declare resources. And within the resource, you would have endpoints based that were for different HTTP verbs, different endpoints. And so you could have an endpoint that was sort of your own login endpoint, which the client passes some other credentials, and then that gets mapped onto an EMS user. I mean, the reason you would want to, or you wouldn't even have to map it onto an EMS user, but the advantage of mapping it onto an EMS user is then you can take advantage of the declarative authorization. So then you could have users and groups that EMS is aware of, and it can allow or deny access to particular resources, your own custom resources, or even the built-in resources. Like you might not want particular users to be able to add new users or add groups or delete groups or things like that.
And I know you, when I create groups and I have users, that's associated for deployment with the user licenses that you purchase. But those user licenses aren't with each EMS server that's running. There's a user license management database, right? That if you have multiple applications on EMS or multiple whatever, you can put all the user licenses in a database. And if a user moves from application to application or server to server, they're still the same user, right? It's not users per EMS server. Like if I have 50 user licenses and I have 3 EMS servers doing different parts of an application, I don't have to log in to 3 different user accounts, or I don't have to use up user accounts.
Well, okay. Well, the idea is that if you have a license, you could have multiple EMS databases, but the license is per interbase server. Okay. So you could have multiple EMS databases. Say you wanted to have, one database that was for one particular application, and you have another database for a different application, and they really have different sets of users. They're completely independent. You could have a license for, say you had a license for 1,000 users. You could have, as long as the sum of all the users on all the databases connected to that particular server is less than 1,000, or then you're that's allowed under the license.
Got it. There was a question earlier, I think it was during Marco's session, where someone who was a VAR has multiple customers, but none of those customers is total of 50. But if they built the application for several of their customers that were doing the same kind of operations, one of their customers could use 10 of the user licenses, another one would use 10 or 20, however they needed, especially if they're small businesses, I think was the comment.
Okay. Well, I mean, I should say that's kind of out of my domain. I mean, exactly that's a kind of a business question. But
architecturally,
in terms of the design, I just described how I think we're going to implement it.
I know there's analytics, and maybe it's separate. There's the whole analytics area of who's calling, what devices are being, how many devices, what back-end APIs are being called, and so on. Is there analytics on users' use and group use of things in EMS, or is it really the APIs and the devices themselves? Do you know?
Right now, the analytics are they're not associated with a particular user, so they're API calls over time to a particular EMS database. Yeah.
And this was another question that came up earlier that was deferred to your time about version. You have all these back-end interfaces or APIs, let's say, and what is a best practice today for versioning any of those back-end interfaces or endpoints, and maybe if you're deploying multiple versions of EMS applications? You do it yourself through a method call. You can use query.
You could change the name of the resource if you want to have different ones for different versions. So you could have one client that uses one resource. I mean, the resources might actually be the same, on the server side for the most part, except for slight differences. There is also a version ID. But I think probably the most straightforward way is to just have a different resource name. Like maybe you just append a number to it or something like that.
Yeah, I know. I think JT showed on the EMS server, if you're in a browser, for example, you can put /versions. So that's the version number of the EMS server infrastructure you're using.
That's
right?
just a resource name version. I mean, that's just, that's not really the same thing. I mean, you want an API version, I think is what you're talking about.
That was the question,
Yeah.
really. But also, I know you're going to deliver updates to the EMS infrastructure, right?
Right.
Over time.
Right.
Version, small updates, larger updates,
Right.
architecture versions, whatever,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And we'll have versioning when we do changes so that the resources have kind of like different signatures. We'll handle that with versioning.
No, that's great. If you have, again, Jim works with the other team members on all of this stuff, and DataSnap, which is continuing, as you heard JT and Marco talk about earlier, and also live binding systems and so on. And then there's people on the team working on FireDeck, which is hooked into all of this as well for database access, not only for EMS itself to work on the things that it does, but also then to talk to other back-end databases that you might want as part of your whole EMS application, whether it's Oracle or Interbase or whatever. So it's all hooked together. But if you have questions about some of that, Jim is here for a couple more minutes before he heads off to other things. And everything is stateless. Marco talked about that. You know, you make a connection, you call an endpoint, and then you get the result back and you move on. And that's great. You could put multiple EMS servers out there if you need to scale in that respect, right? And just have your own system for how the users would connect to different EMS servers that all have the same endpoints defined in the same versions.
Yeah, you can scale it by, for IIS, you could have multiple processes, worker processes, all using the same EMS server DLL. So that's one way to scale. You could have, if you have some kind of load balancing tools, that load balance against multiple ISAPI servers, that you can do that. I mean, the state is all in the database. So as long as you can have as many instances as you want connected to the same database, and it's gonna work out.
And then maybe, I forget if JT or Marco covered this, but when I have my mobile device and I connect through EMS and I bring data through REST JSON down to my mobile device, is it the client application developer's responsibility to secure that data on the local device, the mobile device or whatever it is, or is there something in EMS that helps with that security in the transmission as well as in the local storage?
Okay. Well, there's not anything on the client specifically. I mean, the one thing I would mention that's related to that is not exactly what you asked, but we would want to use, ideally you would use HTTPS for your connection if you wanted to secure the data that was being transmitted between the EMS server and your client. But yeah, once it gets down to the client, you could cache it into an encrypted database like Interbase, embedded database.
And I think Stephen Ball is doing sessions tomorrow on using IB Lite and Interbase to Go in mobile applications. So IB Lite is not secure in that sense. It's like SQLite or other local databases, but Interbase to Go, you can encrypt the data on the mobile device at the database level and at the column level to secure data that you need to secure. If you're leaving it in memory, then it's up to you and your client application code. If you write to a local storage file or a shared storage file, if you're, that's not something like Interbase to Go or some other encrypted system, then again, it's up to the developers and their client apps. But HTTPS absolutely between the user client application, whatever that is, and the EMS server would be the way to go. Now, if you're inside your firewall and you're only doing this for an internal enterprise application, if your network's secure or that you believe it's secure,
right,
then choose what you want to do. Yes.
Right. I mean, they could look at things. Somebody could potentially using some tools, they could see what's going on. I would mention that we don't store any passwords. Everything's all hashed, so that's not really an issue. There is passwords passed over the HTTP connection initially, but then from then on we pass a session ID. So passwords are somewhat protected.
And then and you may have covered this, and I apologize for it. I know in databases I can grant rights to users to be able to access certain tables, use triggers, store procedures, and whatever. Is there a similar kind of mechanism in your authentication authorization for granting who has access to endpoints? And you probably showed that.
Right. So the simple example I used is that I was just granting access to the version resource. But you could also grant access to particular endpoints within a resource based on, what group the user is in or what user it is. And in your code, the other way to do it too is if in your custom resource, you could actually just get the user and get the groups that the user belongs to, and you could actually have code in there that kind of just, instead of relying on the declarative resources in the EMS server.ini, you could just write code that raised an exception if the user was unauthorized.
And again, this is more an EMS question versus authentication authorization. But when you talk about client applications, that's any client target that we support, right? Whether it's a Windows desktop application or it's a mobile application or a VCL app or a FireMonkey app. You've got the interfaces for being able to build client applications of all kinds, right?
Oh yeah, exactly. The components that we use for clients, those components were first developed for Parse and Kinvi clients, and those are for mobile applications. So it works on mobile applications. It works on the Mac. It works on other desktop environments. There are some specific there are some specific things for push notifications, but that only work within the whole framework that are only for mobile devices. But in general, it's all platforms.
Yeah. So even console app, or if somebody was doing a web server side app that then went through the EMS endpoints, that's just me building application.
You could use those components. Yeah. The live, I should mention the live binding stuff is, if you did a console app, you wouldn't want to use live bindings. But I did want to mention too, sometimes you ask me, oh, can I do that? I see you do all that live binding stuff. Can I do that in code too? And I just want to say, absolutely. I just used live bindings because it's really quick. There's a lot of functionality you can demonstrate pretty quickly with live bindings, but all that is just kind of icing on the cake. Underneath you can just use properties or use methods or write everything the old-fashioned way.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Do you have any last words or advice or best practices for everybody as they're exploring the Enterprise Mobility Services system that's in EXE 7? Have fun with it, give feedback.
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to hear, how it's going for people. And I would say actually, tune into Serena's presentations. She's been doing a lot of, that's what I would say. Look at, when you want to find out about EMS, don't just look for EMS, look at the Kinvi and Parse presentations, because that's going to tell you a lot about how to use the BAS components in general. Yeah.
And again, for me, it's great. It's REST and JSON. What could be more standard, more simple? I know that if somebody needed to build a JavaScript example or whatever, if you can make REST calls, if you can send JSON and get JSON back and parse it, you can build all sorts of client-side applications, not even just in C++ or Delphi. You could build them in other systems as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, Jim, thank you very much for being part of CodeRage 9. I know you have so much other work to do, but I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else does as well. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.